The first paper I'm going to read to you was published in a journal called Dialogue and Universalism. It's the journal of the International Society for Universal Dialogue. It was published, it's volume 23, number 3, published in 2013. If any of you would like to join the International Society for Universal Dialogue, you're more than happy. We're more than happy to have people. So many scholars, 150 scholars from around the world. And my paper is about systems thinking. And I quote quite a bit from a man named Ernst Lazlo. But everyone in ISUD has their own version of systems thinking. There are many, many varieties. I like Lazlo because he gives kind of the basics. And then Hindu, Buddhist, the Chinese have their varieties of Neo-Confucianism, Lao Tzu. There's just all over the world, people are thinking more holistically. And my contribution in my scholarship so far has been basically just to bring back the Greeks, but to read them through this filter of systems thinking. Because they were systems thinkers, and I explained that very briefly in this paper. They thought systematically. Actually, they came from the tradition of wisdom literature, and that's why today organizations like ISUD, people are seeing connections between current moves in physics and culture and biology, and social sciences, all sorts of academic disciplines. They are seeing them as more holistic. It's a rejection of the Enlightenment. But at ISUD, people also recognize that this isn't totally new, that actually Hindus had a pretty good insight, and then I bring in the Greeks, and that's usually surprising because people associate the Greeks with the Enlightenment and the Western tradition of what happened after the Greeks. But the Greek culture itself was just one of the wisdom cultures. And so I think it's a nice crossroads between the wisdom traditions and then the birth of something else. Christianity, one of the religions of the book, which is very different from Greek literature and culture, but it was co-opted by Augustine and Aquinas, and then the Enlightenment dealt with it. Sometimes Enlightenment thinkers would co-opt it and say, oh, they're really like us, except we're a more contemporary version, so we're better. Or they would trash it and say, no, Aristotle was totally wrong. So I'm just bringing it back in a form that engages the conversation today. Now, Lazlo, the paper I'm going to read right now, just gives you this broad view of systems, and it does, toward the end of the paper, he refers to the Greeks. And so I just take it from there and expand what the Greeks have to offer. Okay, this is called The Creation of a New Sphere in Today's Era of Globalization. This paper begins with a model of reality called systems thinking, as described by Ervin Lazlo in his book, The Systems View of the World. Lazlo claims that recent developments in many of the sciences and social sciences have led to the development of a new paradigm for our understanding of nature, and human culture. Lazlo presents a vision of the kind of meeting of the minds, or creation of a new sphere, that follows from this new view. Systems thinking opens new avenues for dialogue between ways of thinking that have been cut off from each other for centuries, particularly the split between religious dialogue, philosophy, the sciences, and the social sciences. Lazlo claims that these disciplines are simply parts of a whole, the system of human culture, which is itself a system within the broader system of the natural world, and the universe from which our Earth with its various living and non-living systems formed. Our culture has developed in a way that expects academics to focus on small aspects of reality and to use our brains in specific and limited ways to gain knowledge of a small part within the whole. But the nature of these entities is fundamentally related to the connections between them. Studying them separately gives us a distorted view of reality. Using the different intellectual powers in our brains this way, that is, training some capacities to a high level while ignoring the other ways our brains take in and learn about reality, is not natural. It distorts the goal we all seek, which is truth. The emerging model of reality coming out of many of the sciences requires intellectuals to re-examine their views of human nature and human culture. Further, the new model leads inevitably to a model for ethics, the well-lived life. Lazlo's view is a good starting point for opening up intellectual dialogue between professional philosophers and academics from many different disciplines, as well as with non-academics who focus their intellectual powers on practical and particular choices rather than theoretical models. In the context of the International Society for Universal Dialogue, the system's view provides an argument for encouraging the organization to invite papers from people of all academic disciplines and all walks of life. Interdisciplinary dialogue is not only possible, it will lead to greater insight, a better grasp of the truth than the models Western culture has been based on since the scientific revolution and the Western Enlightenment. Lazlo begins with a definition of worldview. Quote, "Worldviews are constellations of concepts, perceptions, values, and practices that are shared by a community and direct the activities of its members." Further, he claims, the avant-garde branches of the contemporary sciences are veritable fountainheads for the creation of a non-atomistic and non-mechanistic vision that can fill the need for practical guidance in our time. The new system's view can provide the clues, the metaphors, the orientations, and even the detailed models for solving critical problems on this precious but increasingly crowded and exploited planet." Unquote. A complete worldview goes beyond the sciences to provide a model for the good life. Quote, "If a worldview is coherent and embracing, it can also provide a pathway for carrying people through the succeeding epochs of their lives, from childhood through adolescence to adulthood and into old age. We cannot expect to satisfy all the requirements attaching to a worldview in reference to science alone, without also drawing on the insights of religion and the values of humanism." Unquote. Lazlo argues that the model of reality coming from the system sciences is leading to a re-examination and reaffirmation of religious and humanistic traditions. Lazlo is very critical of the Enlightenment worldview, its view of nature, its method for how to gain knowledge of nature, and the way that method was applied to the study of human nature. Quote, "Following the rise of modern science, investigators tended to dissect general questions concerning human nature into specific problems to be handled by specialized research. The classic scientific method led to a vast number of highly accomplished theories concerning man's behavior, dispositions, and even his subconscious. But it also led to the fragmentation of our understanding of human beings. In the midst of all the complex special theories, we've gained little real insight into human nature itself." Unquote. Systems thinking rejects specialization and focuses on studying the relationships between all aspects of reality. Quote, "Opposed to atomism and behaviorism, the system's view links the human being again with the world he or she lives in, for he or she is seen as emerging in that world and reflecting its general characteristics. This holistic approach leads back to a re-examination of the worldview of ancient societies. Quote, "The philosopher-scientists of antiquity viewed the human phenomena within a cosmic context, and held that to understand humans, one must understand their world. Unquote. Systems thinking also leads back to a re-examination of ancient mythological traditions. Quote, in early cultures, rational, emotive, imaginative, and mystical elements were interwoven in syncretic unity. Myth is part science, part art, part religion. Lazlo describes the split between the power of reasoning in the sciences and the powers of imagination and emotion in mythology and religion. Quote, the great split that led to the medieval distinction between moral and natural sciences, and later to the malaise of the two cultures, was foreshadowed in the rivalry of Greek philosophers and dramatists. The global unity of previous cultures was gone and never entirely recovered. And one of the themes of my discussion of the Greeks is that their concern that these parts of life and thought not be split. And they send that message over and over again. So I'll point that out. Lazlo claims that systems thinking requires a re-examination of all the ways of thinking about the world and using the powers of the human brain that have been handed down to us from ancient times, taking the cultural legacy we have been given and adapting it to form a culture that corresponds to human nature as it should be understood on the system's view of reality. Lazlo uses the language of systems thinking to describe human nature. First, he rejects the paradigm of the past. Quote, the human being is not sui generis phenomena that can be studied without regard to other things. Lazlo begins with the basics. A human being is, quote, a natural entity and an inhabitant of several interrelated worlds. By origin, he or she is a biological organism. By work and play, he or she is a social role carrier, and by conscious personality, he or she is a Janus-faced link integrating and coordinating the biological and the social worlds. Unquote. Certainly, Enlightenment thinkers would agree that human beings are both natural and cultural creatures, but the system's view presents a new model for and a new way of describing what it means to be both. First, human beings are very complex systems, along with everything else. Quote, the human individual is a part of a majestic cathedral of great complexity of detail, yet of sweeping simplicity and order in overall design. Unquote. Second, systems thinking has a very different model for how nature and culture fit together. Quote, all parts express the character of the whole, yet all parts are not the same. This is the system's concept of nature, and it is a precondition of coming to know ourselves. Unquote. Third, the development of the world as we know it on Earth is the result of a long evolutionary process that follows certain patterns. Nature is self-constructive, developing from less complex wholes to more complex wholes, from subsystems to natural wholes to supersystems, such as human culture. On this view, quote, the human being is one module in the multi-leveled structure that arose on Earth as a result of nature's penchant for building up in one place what it takes down in others. On multiple levels, each with its own variant of the general system's characteristics which reflect the nature of the self-constructive segment of the world, systems interact with systems and collaboratively form suprasystems. Unquote. Lazlo claims this interaction between systems, calls this interaction a holarchy, and the relation of each individual part of the whole its interface with the system. Human beings, then, are, quote, in the final analysis, a coordinated interface system in the multi-level holarchy of nature. Unquote. On the system's view, consciousness has emerged because nature operates by continually moving and changing toward higher and higher levels of complexity. This process led from non-living to living beings, and from living species with fewer capacities to the emergence of consciousness, then to higher and higher levels of consciousness. As the systems become more complex, the behavior of the system as a whole becomes very different from the behavior of each part or smaller parts. Animals differ in their level of complexity and consciousness. Quote, "The difference between a swarm of bees and a dog is one of degree, not of kind. The dog is a more integrated system than a swarm of bees. Therefore, it is more convenient in more respects to speak of the dog acting than his body's cells doing so." Unquote. Human consciousness is even more complex and creates a system even more removed from the sum of its parts. Quote, "Think how awkward it would be to describe a concert-goer's reaction to Beethoven as the reaction of the cells in his nervous system, not to mention of the subcellular tissues and bodies constituting his nerve cells." Unquote. Further, human beings interact in groups and establish institutions, which also become wholes. Quote, "It is more convenient to speak of a student body being riotous, or bright, or lazy, than each individual student, and of a nation being upset rather than each of its citizens." Unquote. A student body can be bright, for example, without every individual being and every individual student being bright. All natural wholes possess what Lazlo calls subjectivity, quote, "the ability of a system to register internal and external forces affecting its existence in the form of sensations, however primitive they may be. Subjectivity is universal in nature's realm of organized complexity." Unquote. However, human beings are the creature that possesses reflective consciousness, quote, "the ability of a system to be aware of its subjectivity." Unquote. This level of awareness requires a complex nervous system. Quote, "There are good reasons to correlate self-awareness with certain varieties of highly integrated nervous functions performed only by the most evolved nervous systems." Unquote. Given the existence of a complex nervous system, the physical foundation for reflective consciousness, there are two ways to determine if this capacity is being used. Quote, "Whether an organism has developed a language and other symbolic modes of expression and communication, and whether it can transcend the limits of the here and now by making plans not directly triggered by actual stimuli." Unquote. For Lazlo, evidence shows that, quote, "man alone passes this test." Unquote. "Science has determined that, quote, in human beings, the cerebral cortex is the part of the brain that engages in the activity of monitoring the performance of other systems and setting it right when needed." Unquote. Because of the evolution of the cerebral cortex, our ancestors, quote, exploited the limit of genetically programmed behavior because they learned to learn from experience. By reflecting on the events of a hunt, for example, they could abstract its relevant elements and compare them with other occasions. They could select the most successful pattern of behavior and adopt it. As societies became more and more complex, the brunt of the responsibility for survival rested on abstract mental processes, that is, on intelligence. And when I'm doing the Greeks, when I'm talking about them, I will emphasize very much their recognition of pattern recognition, their heightened self-conscious awareness to the point where they recognized, they thought about their thinking, and they figured out that there are patterns everywhere, and that human beings can recognize those patterns, and that's the emergence of culture, is a whole level of interaction between people based on pattern recognition, intelligence. One major factor in the growth of complexity among human beings has been the development of language. Quote, "Human language, in using denotative symbols rather than expressive signs, became an effective instrument for communicating meaning. It enabled our ancestors not only to survive, but to dominate their world. Existence became social existence, within the context of a common set of meanings, communicated by means of a common language. Culture was born, and elaborate forms of social organization created. We became a socio-cultural animal. Human reflective self-consciousness emerged from nature, but it is also unique. It functions as a system in an entirely different way than less complex natural systems. Further, human culture evolved from the original uniting of small groups of human beings in order to survive, but has developed into an entirely different kind of holistic system. Quote, culture is more than a tool of human survival. It is a qualitatively higher phenomenon. Thinking rationally and feeling with clarity and intensity, coupled perhaps with faith and a conscious morality, is qualitatively different from behaviors to assure one's survival and the continuity of the species. Culture and survival functions must not be confused. Unquote. Because culture is a unique whole, disconnected from the need to survive, the cultures human beings have created include an element of choice and can be changed to follow the ideas generated by the cerebral cortex. We can look at patterns from the past, anticipate the future, and plan ahead. We now act in ways that promotes what we think of as the best possible future for future generations. Quote, our evolutionary history determined that we become a cultural creature, but did not determine what kind of culture we would have. Hence, our problem today is not whether to have a culture, it is what kind of culture to have, and this requires some serious thought. Unlike any time in the past, as far as we know, the kind of culture we inherited from our fathers and grandfathers is beginning to challenge our ability to survive on this planet. If we do nothing more than blindly accept it, we may not have the grandchildren to hand it down to. Unquote. Given the situation we're in, we choose to change our behavior by creating a system of values, one aspect of a culture. The systems view provides us with a way of understanding the connection between science and values. Quote, objective value norms can be deduced directly from the contemporary systemic world picture. Values are goals which behavior strives to realize. Any activity which is oriented toward the accomplishment of some end is value-oriented activity. Nothing that pursues an end is value-free. And of course, this is a really big deal in the Greeks, is teleology. Aristotle says all actions are for the sake of some good. And every character in Greek tragedy, every character in Homer, justifies their action by their idea of the good. So, Lazlo is saying this is the way we operate, and of course the Greeks knew that. Both non-human creatures as well as human beings pursue ends and hence have values. The Enlightenment view claimed that the material world has no inherent value. This is where Aristotle's science was that every natural thing pursues its good, and that the good is that toward which all things aim, not just human beings. And that was thrown out by the Enlightenment. So what Lazlo talks about from the point of view of contemporary systems view is what I'm going to talk about from the point of view of the Greek view, and then how the Enlightenment rejected it. And now we're coming back to a new variety of teleology, or final causality. But it's one that I think Aristotle would be right on board, ready to jump in there and get in on the dialogue. He would admit whatever mistakes he might have made, and he would be all ready to get in with the latest research, because that's basically his orientation, was to be as scientific as possible. So, both non-human creatures as well as human beings pursue ends and hence have values. That's both Lazlo and Aristotle. The Enlightenment view claimed that the material world has no inherent value. On the systems view, quote, "There's nothing in all the realms of natural systems which would be value-free when looked at from the vantage point of the systems themselves," unquote. The view of nature during the Enlightenment claimed that values are created by human beings. They are based on the particular material conditions and historical circumstances of a group of people, so they are completely different. Lazlo says, quote, "There's nothing in the sphere of culture which would exempt us from the realm of values. No facts floating around, ready to be grasped without valuations and expectations," unquote. Everything that evolves, including cultures, does so within the context of a system. Cultures depend on natural systems. Enlightenment thinkers encouraged the exploitation of natural resources for human well-being and the development of more and more complex cultural systems. However, the suprasystems of human culture were always ultimately dependent upon the natural systems from which they emerged. This is Francis Bacon's famous "knowledge is power," and he said the purpose of understanding nature is to gain power over it. And that was their value. That was, they thought God wanted them to use science and industry to exploit the natural world for human well-being. And then many of the Enlightenment thinkers also thought the human psyche was a blank slate, and we could develop a science, and we could condition people to be virtuous and generous, and we could solve all of our problems. So this is where current systems thinking rejects that. It rejects nature as simply a blank slate to be exploited, and the human psyche as simply a blank slate to be molded. And all I'm saying again is the Greeks were there, right? They're with you, Mr. Lazlo. It's just that they also have some additional things to add about human nature, the human condition, and culture, which I think need to be in on the conversation. That's why I would bother to go backwards in order to go forwards better, with more insight, gaining the insights from the past and incorporating them into the present and the future. So, on with Lazlo. The study of culture in the social sciences during the Enlightenment period sought to be value neutral. Academic disciplines studied a culture apart from its natural foundations. Today, social scientists who have adopted the systems view are re-examining this approach. In their studies of the suprasystems of culture, they include the interface of a given cultural system with its natural foundations, even as human beings create a culture that is an independent suprasystem. Quote, "Contemporary cultural anthropologists are specifying a number of fundamental universal values shared by people everywhere. The same basic values of survival, mutual collaboration, the raising of children, the worship of transcendent entities, and avoidance of suffering, injustice, and pain are manifested by all cultures, albeit often in radically different ways. The surface forms differ, but the depth structures are analogous." And this is what the Greeks understood. This is my view, that if you were wise, you could understand those patterns in human behavior, positive and negative, that would not change as societies became more complex. So societies would evolve and become more complex, but there would be some basic drives, positive and negative, that have to be trained and educated and become mature. Otherwise, you're just having a more sophisticated culture will just mean that you have more powerful tools for destroying yourself and each other. So the Greeks understood this, that there's basic stuff that doesn't change, and then culture develops from there, but never really eliminates those primitive drives. Some cultures are better at integrating them, and some are worse. Okay, the formation of cultures has led to many, many variations because, quote, there's no imperative attached to the cultural specification of our values. These we can choose according to our insights, unquote. However, there is a natural foundation that does not change. Quote, we remain within the limits of general natural systems values. Finding and respecting these limits is precisely the problem facing us today. Lazlo distinguishes between descriptive values, those behaviors we recognize by observing how people live and asking them why, and normative values, those values that we can figure out as best through studying the nature of reality and its interlocking systems. Quote, normative values, or value norms, are things we discover by examining human characteristics and pointing to those values which could lead people to fulfillment. Hence, normative values are not described, but postulated. They are creations of the inquiring intellect. And just to give you the absolutely most obvious example of that in Homer, is that the Achaeans are a classic example, archetypal example, of a culture dedicated to power. Sparta is also dedicated to military success and achievement. Troy was a city dedicated to wealth, and the story of Homer and Plato is that is an inferior sort of city, that there is a higher level of human fulfillment and human flourishing, and cities should dedicate themselves to the cultivation of the powers of soul in as many citizens as possible to the highest level of possible, and this includes intellectual curiosity, political engagement in society, dialogue, generosity, all sorts of higher quality of life that is human flourishing, not for the sake of money or power or status, just for the sake of realizing our capacities as human beings in the world that we live in. So, where Lazlo talks about descriptive values, you can describe Troy, and you can describe Sparta, and you can describe the Achaeans, which of course Homer does, but normative values, all of those descriptions are always within the context of, this is not the best life. These are not the right choices. These relationships are defective. We can do better than that. And there's always at least one character that represents that higher level. So normative values, there's all of the Greek texts and rituals are always trying to get people to that higher level. They have an idea of the good, and they have a hierarchy of cities and of personal ways of living. To understand values, and ultimately to determine any normative values, systems theorists first have to look at the roles individuals play within a culture. They recognize and describe individuals as parts of much greater wholes. Quote, roles are not made for given individuals, but for kinds of individuals classed according to qualification. When the roles are filled, the particular personality of each new tenant is reflected in his interactions with others, and it produces corresponding shifts within the organizational structure. This is flexibility within the system, as parts adjust to part, unquote. Each system of any kind includes aspects that change and aspects that do not change. Quote, there is a high degree of internal plasticity within any natural system. The system as a whole is determinate, but the relationship of the parts is not. This is not the mechanistic, casual determinism of classical scientists, but the flexible, dynamic, macro-determinism of contemporary systems biologists, psychologists, and social scientists. Again, in Greek culture and literature, a city is a system, and each character represents a type, and it's a type of person that emerges within a type of system. The relationship between the older generation and the younger generation, and all the ways that that can go wrong. Most of the time, the big stories are about what not to do, but there's always somebody there who is doing what you ought to do, which is the reason why you should not do these things, because the other way of life is better. So they're not preaching at you, but they're motivating you by showing you that to choose anything less than the love of wisdom is really self-destructive, destroys other people, but they don't tell you, they show you. Okay, so you want to live for money? Let me tell you this story about Troy. You want to live for power? Okay, let me tell you a story. Um, so that's what I like about the Greek view, and it's so holistic. It gives you the story of humanity from the depths of evil to the heights of good. I mean, they tell so much about our capacities as human beings for both good and evil, for self deception. Uh, oh my gosh. Anyway, um, Lazlo, I think, would like my interpretation of the Greeks, and he would think that, yeah, you can. This is one example. It's not the only one, which, of course, at the ISUD, and Lazlo is on, he's a member of it, he's on the board of the journal and things. I haven't met him, but I honestly think that he would like the way I do the Greeks, and also, but not just the Greeks, plenty of other traditions that have a lot of the same lessons and stories, and they all conclude that we have to build a new sphere. We have to love wisdom, and we have to use our brains in the way that leads to nous. Nous is the part of us that has the idea of the good, and we have to study these different ideas of the good and get it right, and then come together and not argue about doctrines or how we got started. Most of us were introduced to one theory or another. Because I lived in America, it was more likely I'd get introduced to the Greeks. I went to a school for a while that had a big program in Eastern religion. It just somehow didn't take. I didn't have a teacher. I just happened to have a teacher of Greek philosophy, and that was the attraction. But I am totally open to other people, because I think it was an accident of history that I chose this particular tradition. Maybe that I chose philosophy at all, I don't know. But we have to get over our particular historical origins and realize that we really need to build a new sphere and to understand what that means. Okay. On the system's view, the ultimate value is simply the cultivation of all the powers of the human soul in as many people as possible. The best societies are complex systems that function well, meaning with relatively little internal conflict, with a high level of coordination between societies, and with a cooperative relationship with all the other natural and micro systems. Quote, our humanistic goal is to enhance individual fulfillment in an increasingly deterministic, multi-level society composed of greatly differentiated individuals. Like all complex natural systems, human institutions and societies function best when they are spontaneous expressions of the freely chosen activities of their interrelated members. Such a society is the norm against which we must measure existing forms of social structure. Unquote. Again, Lazlo is critical of the Enlightenment worldview because it was focused on nature and human nature from a purely physical point of view. This was false. In spite of the efforts of many leaders and intellectuals, a materialistic way of understanding nature eventually led to the excess value of physical well-being over the cultivation of all the human capabilities. And again, this is not demonizing Enlightenment thinkers. Many of them would be appalled by what's happened to all their wonderful ideas. They really, like John Stuart Mill, he wanted higher pleasures. But Bentham sort of won out on that one. Okay, quote. The Western world offers the values of affluence as the panacea for all social ills. As norms, these values are now superannuated in overcome. In their place, we must propose positive humanistic value norms. Lazlo's model for humanism is universal, even though the underlying universal foundations have been ignored and denied. Quote, humanistic norms are not arbitrary. They are encoded in every natural system, but they can be overlaid by diverse cultural value objectives, and hence, in times of urgency, they need to be consciously rediscovered. Unquote. If we recover these universal natural values, quote, if they are found and adopted, we will again exercise our powers of adaptive innovation in maintaining ourselves and our culture within the thresholds of compatibility with the dynamic and balanced multi-level holarchy that is the biosphere cum humanity, the Gaia system of planet Earth. Given Lazlo's view of reality, the best way of describing the ultimate normative value for human culture is, quote, the actualization of potentials inherent in all of us. Self-fulfillment, as contemporary humanistic thinkers and psychologists acknowledge, is the end of human purposeful behavior. It is the pattern of what can be traced in actuality. Individual fulfillment can be a human value, and it can be specified and analyzed in the system's perspective. Unquote. Lazlo points out that the Greeks had the same overall view. Quote, what are intrinsic human norms? The Greeks had an answer. They said that the end of the good life is happiness. Happiness, Aristotle specified, is the fulfillment of that which is specifically human in us. Unquote. And obviously I will include a lot of Aristotle in my discussion. Besides the Greeks, Lazlo calls for the reintegration of all the world's religions into a set of normative values on the system's model of reality, and he explains why. Quote, science addresses reason and intellect. Humanity, however, is both a rational and a spiritual species. The human being has an intellective as well as an affective faculty. Consequently, if the norms of contemporary humanism are not only to be discovered, but also effectively brought to bear on the thinking and behavior of contemporary people, the rational discoveries of science need to be complemented by affective, time-honored tasks of religion, as religio, the binding and integrating of people within meaningful communities, takes on a fresh aspect. Unquote. Integrating science with religion requires that the world's religions find their common foundation. Lazlo briefly suggests how it could be done. So I'll read Lazlo's one-sentence claims. I actually teach world religions, and so I could give you quotes that show the integration of the different traditions with Greek values. Aristotle has been used, and I think still can be used, his theory of virtues and vices as common underpinning. And then the other texts, tragedies and Homer, can also be seen as describing patterns that of both happiness and misery, good and evil, that you see in these other traditions. For example, when Confucius, when you read the Analects, and you hear the stories about him and what he does, they very much reflect the same virtues of Aristotle. He gets angry or he doesn't get angry. He's generous or he's not. He's temperate. So it's, it's exciting when you finally see these connections. And I won't talk about that a lot. I'll just focus mostly on the Greeks. But Lazlo gives just a summary of what nowadays so many scholars are writing about these common elements. Um, I would hope that they might use some Greek theory to explain theoretically what these are, rather than just analogies. Or the other thing is they can see how Jesus became angry in the temple and Muhammad had righteous indignation, appropriate anger, and Confucius might have. They can recognize the pattern. And then Aristotle talks about rational anger as opposed to holding a grudge or overreacting. But the thing about Aristotle, I would suggest, is that it's so systematic and it gives you so many categories, so which are just to me a light through which to see these other worldviews. It's not the only one, but it is systematic, and it's comprehensive, and it's complex without being obtuse. It just really gets you to reflect and realize how much of your life is archetypal. You have decisions that the type of decisions, the type of choices, the type of experiences that human beings have always had. They just don't reach that level of self-conscious awareness, which you can get to through education, of actually realizing, oh, this is just, I'm a human being and I have this experience because I'm human, just like this book or that play or that story. So that's the idea of wisdom literature. You can get yourself to that plane, that universal level of being a human being, and then you can really learn from the stories because you realize those stories about me. Okay, so I'll just give you Lazlo's one sentence quickie, and I'll just say that, oh yes, there's so much else, and other scholars can do those traditions better than I can, so I'll leave it up to them. Religions would not need to sacrifice or even compromise their cherished tenets to make a unique contribution to this shift. They would only need to draw on their own humanism and ecumenism to encourage creative thinking in regard to the elaboration and extension of their traditional insights. There is obviously a significant humanistic and ecumenical component in every great religion. Judaism sees humans as God's partners in the ongoing work of creation and calls on the people of Israel to be a light to the nations. At the heart of the Christian teaching is love for a universal God reflected in love for one's fellows and service to one's neighbors. Islam too has a universal and ecumenical aspect. Tawhid, the religious witness, there is no God but Allah, is an affirmation of unity, as Allah means divine presence and revelation for all people. Hinduism perceives the essential oneness of mankind within the oneness of the universe, and Buddhism has as its central tenet the interrelatedness of all things in dependent co-origination. In the Chinese spiritual traditions, harmony is a supreme principle of nature and society. In Confucianism, harmony applies to human relationships in ethical terms, while in Taoism it is an almost aesthetic concept defining the relationship between humans and nature. And the Baha'i faith, the newest in the world religions, sees the whole of mankind as an organic unit in process of evolution towards peace and unity, a condition that it proclaims both desirable and inevitable. The great religions could draw on such ecumenical and humanistic elements to nurture a creative elaboration of their fundamental doctrines, supporting and promoting the shift to the new holistic consciousness. Lazlo explains how the nature of physical reality and its evolution fits with the evolution of human nature and human culture. Physical evolution has a spiritual component, and the realm of the spiritual has a physical aspect, because human beings are biological as well as spiritual beings. Lazlo suggests that we should begin with what we now know about the physical universe and its history as a natural foundation for the common theme of unity, oneness, and cooperation in the world's religious traditions. The physical world can be understood spiritually. Quote, the key unifying concept could be the spiritual assessment of the universe's progressive self-creation. The vast sweep of system-building processes, from Big Bang to the emergence of life, mind, and consciousness, could be recognized and indeed celebrated by the religions. The recognition of the evolutionary self-creation of humanity and of the larger reality of the cosmos need not be confined to the empirical sciences. The process is all-embracing and has a spiritual in addition to a physical dimension. We bear, after all, within our own body the impress of every transformation through which the universe has ever passed. And then I'll just say that the Greeks, I would call the Greek position spiritual humanism, and my idea of spiritual is very much what Lazlo's is here, that we can have these ideas of the good. We can see beyond our own experience. We can see a better life, and we can work to achieve it, and our image of the better life can be attainable. We can argue about whether it's attainable or not, but we can form these ideas of a higher level of culture. By spiritual, the Greeks simply mean that our minds are able to recognize patterns. We need to live together. We should create societies that promote intellectual development, that promote the rule of law rather than the rule of power or force or money or tribalism, because that's a spiritual aspiration, to live for the sake of something greater than ourselves or our tribe, to live for the sake of truth, justice, beauty, a better community, a better set of laws, better institutions, a legacy to leave behind to our children. So that's spiritual because it's an idea, and we have to take all of our physical resources and dedicate them to something greater than ourselves. Okay, that's Lazlo, I think, would agree with that. In the process of learning about the nature of reality, one holistic system emerging out of another, we also literally physically develop and stimulate our brains in a way that leads to higher and higher levels of reflective self-consciousness. We use language to develop communication networks based on both the spoken and written word, leading to a more complete and complex body of recorded knowledge that is passed down to the next generation. This cultural legacy provides the occasion to develop an even more complex and accurate model of reality and a more complete and universal grasp of underlying normative values. The intellectual search for truth has a physical component in the brain and a non-physical spiritual component. The emerging systems are made up of connections in the world, in our brains, in our words, and in our minds, as we reflect upon how the systems relate to each other and to ourselves as learners. Systems theory recognizes all these connections. Quote, not only our bodies, but also our minds are immanent to this process. The forces that brought forth the quarks and the photons in the early moment of the radiance-filled cosmos, that condensed galaxies and stars in expanding space-time, and that created the complex molecules and systems on a life-bearing planet. These forces inform our brain and thus infuse our mind. they could come to self-recognition in each thinking and feeling human being, unquote. Human beings have always sought knowledge and many other ways to develop their potential. These purposes have always created values. Quote, values define cultural man's need for rationality, meaningfulness in emotional experience, richness of imagination, and depth of faith, unquote. In the past, these values have been considered unique to each individual or to each integrated culture. Today, using systems theory, our understanding of all aspects of reality and all inherent human capacities should lead from mere descriptions of different values to a comprehensive worldview that integrates human rationality, emotions, imagination, and faith. This integration leads to the formation of a system of normative values. This system would describe how all the evolved systems work together best. Religions today should embrace the self-conscious awareness of this view as normative, not just descriptive. Quote, by recognizing and celebrating the world's evolutionary self-creation, religions could promote the process of recognition in each individual. The particular intellectual capacity for recognizing this whole, Lazlo calls nous, following the Greek view. The formation of a sphere of human culture where we recognize the integration of all aspects of reality is what Lazlo calls a noosphere of human interaction. On Lazlo's view, the world's religions could and should, quote, celebrate the evolution of the noosphere on Earth as the next and especially significant phase in the world's evolutionary self-creation. The self-creating universe is our larger self, our primary sacred community, unquote. The spiritual is not separated from the physical. The sacred is not separated from the profane. What is known through reason is not separated from what is known from the inspiration to seek a higher level of complexity beyond what one observes. Given the fact that the Enlightenment view has now led humanity to the brink of self-destruction, it is imperative that human beings develop a new sphere, as Lazlo understands it. The purpose is related to recognizing the fact that all of reality is a series of interconnected systems, and the necessary consequences of this for the kind of culture we must develop in order to avoid self-destruction is a normative way of constructing values, not merely descriptive. It should be a guide for how we ought to behave, not a description of one way of actualizing our potentials that is no better or worse than many others. Lazlo points out that in the past, the world's great religions also emerged as a way of addressing a crisis in the cultures from which they emerged. Quote, religious renewal always came in the wake of civilizational crisis. It was in the disastrous moments of the history of Israel that the prophets of Judea made their appearance. Christianity established itself in the chaos left by the moral weakening of the citizens of a declining Roman Empire. The Buddha appeared in a period of spiritual and social confusion in India. Muhammad proclaimed his mission in an epoch of disorder in Arabia, and Baha'u'llah wrote in confinement imposed by a moribund Ottoman Empire. Unquote. The ecological crisis we face today is perhaps the most serious humanity has faced, which is why the resources of the world's religions need to be harnessed to address this crisis. Today, at a time when humankind is in the throes of the greatest and deepest transformation it has ever known, there is a great need for a creative extension of the traditional fundaments of the great religions to complete and complement the rational worldview that is already emerging within the new sciences. With an alliance between science and religion, the shift to a systemic and holistic worldview would be reinforced. Both through reason and through feeling, contemporary people could be brought into closer harmony with each other and with their environment. And this brings me to the first thing I loved about Greek thought. I was an environmentalist in 1968. I was in high school, and I had some biologist friends who told me about environmental issues, and it was very depressing. Um, I remember, trying to figure out how to get up in the morning.